July 16th, 1945. Potsdam, Germany. The summer air over the shattered German capital carried the smell of brick dust, wet stone, and burned timber. Berlin lay only a short distance away, broken open by years of bombing and the final Soviet assault. Its avenues clogged with rubble, its walls scarred by shell fire, its people moving like ghosts through the ruins of a world that had collapsed. In nearby Potsdam, inside the guarded grounds where the victorious Allies had gathered, President Harry S. Truman was still learning the full weight of his office. He had been president for only 3 months. Franklin Roosevelt had died in April, leaving Truman with the war, the peace, and secrets so immense that even the vice president had barely been told they existed. Now Truman sat among men who had commanded empires and armies through the greatest conflict in human history. Winston Churchill, cigar in hand, carried the confidence of a nation that had survived the Blitz. Joseph Stalin, heavy-faced and watchful, controlled an army that occupied half of Europe. Truman, the former senator from Missouri, had arrived in Germany determined not to be intimidated. But on this day, a message reached him from the desert of New Mexico. It did not describe a normal weapon. It did not speak in the language of ordinary explosives, artillery, or air raids. The coded report told him that the first test of the atomic bomb had succeeded. At 5:29 in the morning, at a site called Trinity, a device nicknamed the Gadget had detonated above the Jornada del Muerto desert. For a moment, night had turned to a white and purple dawn. Sand had fused into green glass. A fireball had risen into the sky, boiling upward into a tower of smoke and dust. Men who had built it watched from bunkers and trenches, some cheering, some silent, some suddenly afraid of what their own hands had made. The report was passed through Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson and the small circle of men who understood what it meant. Truman read the news and understood enough. The United States had built a weapon unlike anything ever used in war. It was no longer theory. It was no longer a gamble buried in laboratories at Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford. It was real. For months, the Pacific War had continued with a violence that seemed to grow more savage the closer American forces came to Japan. Iwo Jima had cost thousands of marine lives. Okinawa had become a nightmare of caves, artillery, kamikaze attacks, and civilians trapped between armies. American planners were studying an invasion of the Japanese home islands, and the casualty estimates were grim. Every report reaching Truman told the same story. Japan's military government still refused unconditional surrender. Now, in Potsdam, Truman held a possible way to end the war before that invasion began. Yet the weapon was not simply another bomb to be loaded into another aircraft. The decision before him was political, military, moral, and historical all at once. He had inherited the Manhattan Project, but now he alone would carry the responsibility for its use. The bomb had been built in secrecy by more than 100,000 workers, most of whom never knew the purpose of their labor. Scientists had split the atom. Generals had prepared special aircraft. Target committees had studied Japanese cities. The machine was already moving. Truman's reaction was not theatrical. He did not shout. He did not gather the room and declare victory. Those near him saw a man who became more alert, more confident, more certain in the pressure of negotiation. The successful test gave him leverage at Potsdam, especially with Stalin, whose armies were expected to enter the war against Japan. It also gave him a dreadful instrument that could end one war while opening a new age. In his private reflections, Truman grasped the danger of such power falling into the wrong hands. He wrote that it was certainly a good thing for the world that Hitler's people had not discovered the atomic bomb first. The thought was not abstract. Europe's ruins surrounded him. The evidence of Nazi ambition, cruelty, and destruction was everywhere. Had Germany built such a weapon before its defeat? The war might have entered a darkness beyond imagination, but Germany was beaten. Japan was not, and across the world, on a remote Pacific island, modified B-29 bombers of the 509th Composite Group were preparing for a mission their crews only partly understood. In sealed briefings and guarded workshops, the first combat atomic weapon was being assembled piece by piece. Truman now knew the bomb was ready. The question was no longer whether it could work. The question was where, when, and how it would be used. July 17th, 1945. Sicilienhof Palace, Potsdam. The conference rooms looked almost untouched by war. Polished tables, heavy chairs, tall windows, neat maps spread beneath the hands of men deciding the future of continents. Outside the palace grounds, Germany was starving, occupied, and silent beneath the boots of the armies that had crushed it. Inside, the air was formal, careful, and loaded with suspicion. Every greeting had meaning, every pause had meaning, every word spoken across the table carried the weight of millions dead and millions more displaced. Harry S. Truman entered these rooms with his back straight and his jaw set. He was not Roosevelt. Everyone knew it. Roosevelt had dealt with Churchill and Stalin for years. He had possessed charm, patience, and an almost effortless ability to conceal his final intentions. Truman had none of Roosevelt's aristocratic ease. He was plain-spoken, direct, and still surrounded by advisors who had served another president before him, but he was learning quickly. When Truman had first entered the White House after Roosevelt's death, Secretary of War Henry Stimson had brought him into the secret. The United States was building a bomb of almost unimaginable destructive force. The project had consumed entire towns, hidden factories, military reservations, university laboratories, and industrial plants. Uranium had been enriched in Tennessee. Plutonium had been produced in Washington State. Theoretical designs had been transformed into metal, wire, explosive lenses, and firing circuits in the mountains of New Mexico. Truman had listened. He had asked questions, but until the Trinity message arrived, the bomb remained a promise. Now it was a fact. Stimson was 77 years old, stooped by age but still precise, disciplined, and deeply aware of the historical burden. He understood the atomic bomb not simply as a weapon, but as a force that might reshape civilization. General Leslie R. Groves, the hard-driving Army officer who had commanded the Manhattan Project, understood it through schedules, security, production, and delivery. To Groves, uncertainty had been an enemy to be defeated. Every delay had been attacked, every scientist pressed, every industrial bottleneck forced open. The result now sat in Truman's hands. On the Pacific maps, the war seemed to move by islands and arrows, but behind every arrow was blood. Saipan, Peleliu, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. The closer the Americans came to Japan, the more desperate the fighting became. Japanese soldiers had shown a willingness to fight from caves, tunnels, bunkers, and ruined ground until they were burned out, blasted out, or buried inside. Kamikaze pilots had dived into ships with enough force to tear steel open and send burning fuel across decks packed with sailors. On Okinawa, American troops had seen civilians leap from cliffs or die in artillery fire as the island became a preview of what an invasion of Japan might bring. The planned invasion had a name: Operation Downfall. It would begin with landings on Kyushu, followed later by a strike toward the Tokyo plain. Commanders studied beaches, tides, railways, airfields, and the strength of Japanese defenses. The numbers changed from report to report, but none of them offered comfort. American casualties could be severe. Japanese casualties could be catastrophic. Civilian deaths might reach levels no one could honestly predict. Truman carried those possibilities with him at Potsdam. He also carried another reality. The Soviet Union had promised to enter the war against Japan. Stalin's armies, hardened by the Eastern Front, were already positioned near Manchuria. Their entry could help force Japan's surrender, but it would also expand Soviet influence in Asia. Truman had seen what Soviet occupation meant in Eastern Europe. Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and other countries were already falling under Moscow's shadow. The war against Hitler had made Stalin an ally. The peace was making him something else. The atomic bomb changed that calculation. It gave Truman confidence. Men around him noticed it. Churchill later remembered a difference in Truman after the news from New Mexico. The American president seemed firmer. He spoke with greater assurance. When the leaders met, Truman no longer appeared as a newcomer, merely filling Roosevelt's chair. He appeared as the head of a nation holding a secret power. Still, secrecy surrounded every step. Truman did not announce to Stalin that the United States had successfully tested an atomic bomb. Not yet. Not plainly. At Potsdam, the Americans still debated how much to say, when to say it, and whether a warning to Japan should mention the weapon directly. The bomb's existence was known to only a narrow circle, and even within that circle, there were disagreements. Some argued for a demonstration. Perhaps the bomb could be exploded on an uninhabited area before Japanese observers. Perhaps its force alone would shock Tokyo into surrender. Others doubted this would work. What if the demonstration failed? What if Japanese leaders dismissed it? What if prisoners of war were moved into target areas after warning was given? What if only actual destruction could break the will of a government that had already sacrificed entire cities to firebombing? These questions moved through memoranda, meetings, and private conversations. But the war did not pause while men debated. In Japan, the leadership remained divided and rigid. Some officials knew the war was lost. Others still hoped to secure better terms, preserve the imperial system, or force such heavy American casualties that Washington would compromise. The word surrender remained dangerous. To some officers, it was treason. To others, it was unthinkable. Truman did not know every argument inside Tokyo, but he knew the result. No surrender, and so the pressure narrowed. He could continue conventional bombing and blockade. He could wait for Soviet entry. He could prepare the invasion, or he could use the new weapon. In Potsdam, under chandeliers and guarded ceilings, Truman listened, judged, and decided how to speak. His words mattered. The first atomic bomb was ready. But before the world saw its fire, Japan would receive one final warning. It would be written in the language of surrender, destruction, and consequences. And Truman, holding the secret from the desert, would help send it. July 26th, 1945. Potsdam, Germany. The words were chosen to sound final. They moved from drafts to desks, from advisors to leaders, from military necessity into diplomatic form. The document did not mention the atomic bomb by name. It did not describe uranium, plutonium, implosion lenses, or the desert flash at Trinity. It did not reveal the secret laboratories, the hidden factories, or the special B-29 crews waiting in the Pacific. Yet every sentence carried the shadow of the weapon Truman now knew was ready. The Potsdam Declaration called on Japan to surrender without condition. It promised that the Japanese people would not be enslaved or destroyed as a nation. It promised that military power and wartime leadership would be removed. It promised occupation, disarmament, justice for war criminals, and eventually a peaceful government formed according to the will of the people. But it also warned that refusal would bring prompt and utter destruction. Those words were meant to strike Tokyo like a bell. Prompt and utter destruction. Inside the American delegation, the meaning was clear. The United States had already burned Japanese cities with conventional incendiary raids. Tokyo had suffered a night of fire in March that killed tens of thousands. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama, and many others had been struck again and again by B-29 formations. The Japanese home islands were blockaded, their shipping was strangled, their cities were vulnerable. But the new weapon promised destruction on a different scale. A single aircraft carrying the ruin that once required hundreds. Truman understood the severity of the phrase. He also understood that the warning gave Japan one more chance across the Pacific. However, the men who would deliver the bomb were already moving deeper into history. On Tinian, in the Mariana Islands, the heat pressed down like a hand. The island was a vast American air base carved from coral and jungle, crowded with runways, Quonset huts, fuel tanks, repair shops, bomb pits, trucks, guards, and the constant roar of engines. The 29 superfortresses stood beneath the sun with silver skins bright enough to hurt the eyes. Mechanics worked shirtless in the humidity. Armorers handled strange components under tight security. Military police guarded areas where ordinary airmen were not allowed to linger. The 509th Composite Group looked like an ordinary bomber unit from a distance, but it was not ordinary. Colonel Paul W. Tibbets had trained its crews for a mission unlike any other in aviation. They practiced long flights, sharp climbs, and violent turns designed to escape the shock wave after release. They dropped heavy practice bombs called pumpkins, shaped like the real weapon but filled with conventional explosives. They learned procedures, timing, and silence. Many of them did not know the full nature of the bomb. They knew only that it was huge, secret, and important. Tibbets knew more. So did Captain William S. Parsons, the naval ordnance expert who would arm the first atomic bomb in flight. The weapon that would eventually be loaded for combat was called Little Boy. It was a gun-type uranium bomb, long, heavy, and blunt-nosed, built to force one piece of enriched uranium into another at high speed. Compared with the implosion device tested at Trinity, Little Boy was considered simple enough that it had not been tested before combat. Its confidence came from calculations, engineering, and the scarcity of the material inside it. Every part of it represented a national effort hidden from the public. At Potsdam, Truman's world was papers, conferences, maps, and coded reports. On Tinian, the same decision became bolts tightened by hand, bomb bay fittings checked under floodlights, and flight crews waiting for orders that would not be explained until the final hours. The distance between the conference table and the runway was vast, but the chain of command connected them as directly as a wire. Then came another moment of tension. Truman decided to tell Stalin something, not everything. Not enough to reveal the full secret, but enough to test the Soviet leader's reaction. On July 24th, during the conference, Truman approached Stalin and casually mentioned that the United States had developed a new weapon of unusual destructive force. The words were careful. The tone was almost offhand. Churchill watched closely, expecting Stalin to show surprise, alarm, or curiosity. Stalin did not. He nodded. He said he was glad to hear it and hoped the Americans would make good use of it against Japan. His calm response unsettled those who watched. To Truman and Churchill, it seemed possible Stalin had not understood, but Stalin understood more than he showed. Soviet intelligence had already penetrated the Manhattan Project. Reports from spies had reached Moscow. The Soviet leader did not know every operational detail, but he knew the Americans had been working on an atomic bomb. His face remained unreadable because he wanted it that way. The war was ending, but the next struggle was already beginning. Still, Truman's immediate problem was Japan. The Potsdam Declaration went out over radio and through diplomatic channels. Its message was blunt. Surrender now, or face destruction. In Washington, military planners watched for signs. In the Pacific, commanders waited. On Tinian, the 509th continued preparing. Across Japan, officials received the Allied demand and weighed it against pride, fear, ideology, and the crumbling reality of defeat. For the Japanese people, the declaration passed over a country already exhausted by hunger, fire, and grief. Trains moved through blackened cities. Families dug shelters. Mothers searched for rice. Soldiers trained civilians with bamboo spears. Children carried water in buckets and listened for sirens. Above them, American aircraft crossed the sky almost at will. In Tokyo, the response did not come as Truman hoped. Japan's leaders did not accept the declaration. The government did not surrender. Publicly, the warning was dismissed. The machinery of war kept turning, even though it was grinding toward disaster. For Truman, the silence and rejection hardened the road ahead. He had offered the warning. He had seen the test succeed. He had heard from his advisors. He knew the invasion plans. He knew the casualty fears. He knew the bomb was ready. Now the decision moved from words to orders. And on a hot island runway in the Pacific, men began preparing an aircraft that would carry the first atomic weapon ever used in war. August 2nd, 1945. Tinian Island, Mariana Islands. The orders arrived in the language of targets, aircraft, weather, and timing. There was no thunder in the paper itself. No flame, no scream of collapsing buildings. Just instructions passing through secure channels from high command to the men who would carry out the mission. The words were clipped. Military. Deliberate. They named cities. They named conditions. They named authority. The first special bomb mission would be flown as soon as weather permitted after August 3rd. The target list had been studied for weeks. Hiroshima stood first. It was a city of military value, a communications center, a depot, and headquarters for the Second General Army. It had not yet been burned to the ground like so many other Japanese cities. Its rivers cut through the city like dark veins. Its bridges, barracks, factories, homes, schools, temples, and shops lay within a basin surrounded by hills. For planners searching for a place where the bomb's force could be measured, Hiroshima presented a terrible clarity. Tinian pulsed with preparation. At North Field, B-29s taxied under the tropical sky, their 4 engines beating the air into waves of heat and noise. Ground crews shouted over prop wash. Fuel trucks rolled past coral dust and oil stains. Men smoked in the shade and pretended not to stare at the guarded bomb assembly areas. The 509th Composite Group had trained for this, yet the final approach of the mission brought a different silence. Practice was gone. The next time the special weapon left the island, it would not be a drill. Colonel Paul Tibbets chose his aircraft and gave it a name. The B-29 number 82 had been modified under the Silver Plate program. Its bomb bay had been altered, its weight reduced, its engines tuned for the long route to Japan and back. On the nose, Tibbets had the name Enola Gay painted in black letters, after his mother, Enola Gay Tibbets. To the men who saw it, the name looked almost gentle, a mother's name on a machine prepared to carry the most destructive weapon yet made by human hands. The contrast was hard to escape. Inside secure storage, Little Boy waited. The bomb was more than 10 feet long, heavy, awkward, and plain. It did not look like the end of an age. It looked like a long metal cylinder with fins, a blunt instrument built for gravity and physics. Yet inside it was enriched uranium, rare and costly beyond measure, brought together through a design that scientists believed would unleash energy from the heart of matter itself. Captain William Parsons studied the dangers with care. Little Boy used a gun-type assembly. If fully armed on the ground, an accident during takeoff could scatter catastrophe across the runway. Tinian's runways were long, but B-29s were heavy, and takeoff with a full fuel load and a massive bomb was never simple. Parsons made a decision. He would arm the bomb in flight. That choice meant he and his assistant, Second Lieutenant Morris Jepson, would work inside the aircraft after takeoff, handling the final steps while the bomber droned over the dark Pacific. Truman was far away from Tinian by then, returning from Potsdam aboard the cruiser USS Augusta. The president was no longer standing among the ruins of Europe. He was at sea, surrounded by gray water, naval discipline, and messages moving through radio rooms. The war map followed him. So did the decision. A president could leave the conference, but he could not leave the consequences. When the first atomic bomb had proven successful, Truman had spoken of it with a mixture of relief and gravity. He believed it might end the war. He believed it might save American lives that would otherwise be lost in an invasion. He also knew it was a weapon of terrible force. The phrase he had approved at Potsdam, prompt and utter destruction, was no longer diplomatic pressure. It was becoming operational fact. In Japan, the government still had not accepted the Allied terms. The silence from Tokyo was not empty. It was filled with argument. Some leaders searched for a way to end the war without destroying the imperial institution. Others clung to the hope that Soviet mediation might secure better terms. Military hardliners believed that the coming invasion could be met with such ferocity that the Americans would bargain. They prepared soldiers, civilians, aircraft, boats, and suicide weapons for a final defense of the homeland. None of them knew that the first atomic mission was already forming. On the evening before the flight, the crew of the Enola Gay gathered for briefing. Maps appeared. Weather reports were discussed. Primary and secondary targets were explained. Hiroshima, Kokura, Nagasaki. The men learned more than most had known before. They were told the bomb they carried had power, unlike anything dropped from an aircraft. Some understood. Some could only measure the words against the weapons they already knew and failed to imagine the difference. The mission would involve more than one aircraft. The Enola Gay would carry the bomb. Other B-29s would observe, photograph, and record the results. Weather planes would fly ahead to report conditions over the target cities. The timing had to be precise. The sky over Hiroshima needed to be clear enough for visual bombing. The weapon would not be dropped blindly through cloud. The city had to be seen. Before departure, Chaplain William Downey offered a prayer. The men stood near the aircraft in the darkness. The tropical air was warm. Engines waited cold and silent. Beyond the runway, the Pacific stretched black and endless. Some crewmen shifted their weight. Some looked at the ground. Some stared at the bomber that would carry them into a morning no one could fully imagine. Then the routine began. Flight gear, checklists, final inspections, fuel loads, instruments, oxygen, parachutes, sidearms, codes, cameras, scientific equipment, the bomb bay doors, the weight of little boy suspended inside. At 2:45 in the morning on August 6th, 1945, the Enola Gay began its takeoff roll. The bomber gathered speed slowly, heavily, engines straining, tires hammering along the runway. Men watching from the field held their breath. A crash at that moment would have been a disaster beyond calculation. The aircraft moved faster, faster, still heavy, still earthbound, then lifted into the darkness above Tinian. Inside, Parsons prepared to arm the bomb. The Pacific lay ahead. Japan lay beyond it. Truman's decision, carried by aluminum, fuel, uranium, and men, was now airborne. August 6th, 1945. Aboard USS Augusta, Atlantic Ocean. The message reached President Truman at sea. He was returning from Potsdam when the news came through official channels. Far across the world, the Enola Gay had reached Hiroshima in clear morning weather. At 8:15 local time. Little boy had fallen from the bomb bay and dropped toward the city below. 43 seconds later, the weapon detonated above Hiroshima with a flash that seemed to tear the morning apart. On the ground, people saw light before they understood sound. A white glare filled streets, homes, offices, schools, and barracks. Heat struck exposed skin. Roof tiles cracked, wooden houses burst into flame, windows shattered inward, walls collapsed. The blast moved outward faster than thought, crushing buildings, throwing bodies, overturning trams, and ripping through a city that seconds earlier had been beginning an ordinary day of war. At the center, the city became fire, dust, and silence broken by cries. Above it, the crew of the Enola Gay felt the shockwave hit the aircraft. The bomber lurched in the sky. Tail gunner. Staff Sergeant George Caron saw the cloud rising behind them, boiling upward with colors and force unlike any explosion he had ever seen. Pilot Paul Tibbets kept the aircraft moving away. The men had practiced the escape turn, but practice had not prepared them for the sight of a city vanishing beneath a column of smoke. When Truman received confirmation, he was surrounded not by cheering crowds but by naval officers, coded messages, and the controlled atmosphere of a ship at sea. Yet the news changed everything. The weapon had worked in combat. The secret was secret no longer. The world had entered the atomic age, whether the world understood it yet or not. Truman responded with visible emotion. He told those nearby that this was the greatest thing in history. The phrase carried triumph, relief, and the shock of power suddenly revealed. No, for him, the bomb was not merely a scientific achievement. It was a weapon he believed could force Japan to surrender and spare the bloodshed of invasion. In that moment, he saw the possibility that the long war might finally be approaching its end. But he also had to speak to the world. That afternoon, a presidential statement was released under Truman's name. It announced that an American airplane had dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. The statement explained that the bomb drew power from the basic force of the universe, from the force from which the sun drew its power. It told Americans that the United States had won the race of discovery against Germany. It revealed that the Manhattan Project had involved vast factories, enormous expense, and secret labor across the country. The words were dramatic, but also controlled. Truman wanted Japan to understand the meaning immediately. The statement warned that if Japan did not accept the Potsdam terms, it could expect a rain of ruin from the air, unlike anything ever seen on Earth. The phrase was meant as both warning and threat. It was also a signal that Hiroshima was not necessarily the end. More bombs might follow. More cities might face the same fate. The Japanese leadership had been given a final chance before the first atomic strike. Now they were being warned again after it. The statement also carried a second message, aimed at the American people. For years, they had known nothing of the Manhattan Project. Workers at Oak Ridge, Hanford, and Los Alamos had lived under secrecy. Soldiers guarded gates without knowing what they protected. Factory workers handled materials whose purpose was hidden behind compartmentalized orders. Scientists had argued, calculated, and struggled under immense pressure. Now the president revealed that this secret enterprise had produced a weapon powerful enough to destroy a city. To Americans exhausted by nearly 4 years of war, the announcement promised an end. Families with sons in uniform read the news and imagined the invasion that might not have to happen. Marines who had survived the Pacific Islands understood what another landing might cost. Sailors who had endured kamikaze attacks knew what desperation looked like when it came burning out of the sky. Soldiers training for Operation Downfall could look at the headline and wonder whether they would be spared the beaches of Kyushu. Yet in Hiroshima, there were no headlines in those first hours. There was only ruin. Survivors moved through a city that no longer made sense. Some walked with burned skin hanging from their arms. Some searched for children beneath collapsed houses. Some crawled toward rivers, driven by thirst and heat. Fires spread through neighborhoods. Hospitals were shattered. Doctors and nurses were dead, injured, or overwhelmed. Communications failed. Nobody in Tokyo immediately understood the full scale of what had happened. The weapon's destructive force was physical, but its political force depended on comprehension. At first, Japanese authorities struggled to identify the nature of the attack. One aircraft, one bomb, one city devastated. Reports sounded impossible. Military men examined the evidence and tried to measure it against known weapons. The idea of an atomic bomb had existed in theory, but theory had not prepared them for Hiroshima. Truman's statement removed the doubt. This was atomic power. This was the weapon whose readiness had reached him at Potsdam after the Trinity test. This was the secret that had stiffened his confidence among the Allied leaders. This was the answer to the question that had followed him from conference table to ship cabin to the open sea. What would he say when the first atomic bomb was ready? At first, in private, he had said it was a good thing for the world that Hitler had not discovered it. At Potsdam, through the Allied declaration, he had warned Japan of prompt and utter destruction. After Hiroshima, he told the world that the bomb existed, that it had been used, and that Japan faced ruin if it continued the war. But the war still did not end that day. Tokyo did not immediately surrender. Messages moved slowly. The leadership remained divided. Some men could not grasp the scale of the disaster. Others grasped it and still could not bring themselves to accept unconditional defeat. The military still held power. The emperor remained surrounded by officials who feared both invasion and capitulation. The Soviet Union had not yet entered the war, but its armies were poised to move. On USS Augusta, Truman waited for the result that had not yet come. The first bomb had fallen. The world had heard the president's warning. Hiroshima burned, and still the machinery of war continued toward the next target. August 9th, 1945. Washington, D.C. By the time Truman was back in the capital, the war had entered its final convulsion. The White House felt different from the moving world of Potsdam and the enclosed decks of USS Augusta. There were telephones, briefing papers, military aides, secretaries, maps, and corridors where footsteps carried quickly beneath high ceilings. Outside, Washington sweltered in summer heat. Inside, the president faced a chain of events moving faster than any man could fully control. Hiroshima had been struck. Japan had not surrendered. Then, on August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. Red Army forces crossed into Manchuria with overwhelming strength, attacking Japanese positions that had once seemed secure behind distance and empire. The Kwantung Army, long presented as a symbol of Japanese military power, was hit by tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft in a sudden storm from the north and west. Stalin had entered the Pacific War exactly as promised, but now his entry carried a new urgency. Every hour the war continued gave Soviet forces more ground, more influence, and more claim upon the post-war settlement in Asia. For Truman, the pressure sharpened. The atomic bomb had been meant to shock Japan into surrender before an invasion became necessary. It had also, whether stated openly or not, changed the balance among the Allies. But shock alone had not produced immediate surrender. Inside Tokyo, the Supreme Council for the direction of the war remained split. Some leaders understood that Hiroshima and Soviet entry had made continued resistance hopeless. Others still wanted conditions, especially guarantees concerning the emperor. Military hardliners still spoke of one decisive battle on the homeland, a final bloodletting so costly that the enemy would soften its terms. Then the second atomic mission was already in motion. The original target was Kokura, a city of arsenals and industry. It lay beneath clouds and smoke when the B-29 boxcar arrived. Major Charles Sweeney circled, searching for a clear view, burning fuel with every pass. The bomb in his bay was not Little Boy. It was Fat Man, a plutonium implosion weapon closer in design to the device tested at Trinity, rounder, heavier, and more complex. It had been built around explosive lenses that compressed plutonium inward until a nuclear chain reaction erupted. The weather did not open over Kokura. Fuel ran low. The aircraft turned toward Nagasaki. Nagasaki was not the clean, open target the planners preferred. Hills enclosed parts of the city. Industrial districts lay among valleys. Homes, schools, churches, factories, and crowded neighborhoods. At 11:02 a.m., Fat Man detonated above the city. The blast was partly confined by terrain, but what it struck, it destroyed with monstrous force. Factories vanished, houses collapsed, fires rose, people below were burned, crushed, blinded, and buried beneath the second atomic cloud in human history. When news reached Washington, it confirmed that Hiroshima had not been a solitary warning. The United States had more than one atomic weapon, and it had used the second. Yet Truman's reaction now contained more strain than celebration. The first announcement had carried triumph and relief. After Nagasaki, the human cost became harder to hold at a distance. Reports of devastation were still incomplete, but no one around the president could mistake what these weapons did to cities. They did not simply strike military installations. They consumed streets, homes, and civilians along with barracks, factories, and depots. Truman would soon move to halt further atomic bombing without his direct approval. That decision mattered. It showed that even as he defended the use of the bomb as necessary to end the war, he was not prepared to let atomic strikes continue as routine military operations. The weapon had crossed a boundary. It could not be treated like ordinary ordnance. The president had opened the atomic age, and almost immediately he felt the need to place his hand back on the machinery. In Tokyo, the crisis reached the emperor. Hirohito had been distant from public view for most of the war, wrapped in ritual, hierarchy, and the dangerous reverence of the imperial state. But now the state itself faced destruction. Hiroshima had been erased by one bomb. Nagasaki had suffered the same fate. Soviet forces were tearing through Manchuria. The invasion of Japan still loomed if surrender did not come. The leaders could not agree. The deadlock held. At last, the emperor intervened. Japan would accept the Allied terms, provided the imperial institution could be preserved in some form. Even this did not end the danger immediately. Fanatical officers attempted to prevent surrender, searching for the recording of the emperor's message and trying to keep the war alive by force. But the effort failed. On August 15th in Japan, the emperor's voice reached the people by radio, thin, formal, and unlike anything they had ever heard. He did not use the blunt word surrender in the ordinary way. He spoke instead of enduring the unendurable. For many Japanese civilians, it was the first time they had heard his voice. For American soldiers and sailors, the news meant they might live across the Pacific. Men who had expected to storm beaches, caves, bunkers, and cities felt the impossible pressure lift. Ships sounded horns. Crowds filled streets. Families wept. In Washington, New York, London, Manila, and countless small towns, people celebrated the end of a war that had consumed years of fear and sacrifice. The relief was real. So was the shadow behind it. Truman's words about the first atomic bomb would remain fixed in history because they revealed the terrible mixture at the heart of his decision. When he learned at Potsdam that the test had worked, he recognized the bomb as a decisive force and a terrifying one. He believed it was fortunate that Nazi Germany had not possessed it. He believed it could force Japan to surrender. He approved a warning that promised prompt and utter destruction if Japan refused. After Hiroshima, he told the world that atomic power had been unleashed and warned of more ruin from the air. After Nagasaki, he began drawing the weapon back under presidential control. The decision did influence the final stage of the Pacific War. It helped break the deadlock, shocked Japanese leaders, combined with Soviet entry to make continued war impossible, and ended the fighting before Operation Downfall could begin. But it also opened questions no victory parade could silence. How should military necessity be weighed against civilian suffering? Could a weapon of such scale ever be contained once used? Did the bomb end the war, or did it begin another kind of war? Colder, quieter, and more permanent. Truman carried his answer for the rest of his life. He insisted that he had made the decision to save lives and end the war as quickly as possible. He did not present himself as a man seduced by destruction. He presented himself as a president forced into command at the edge of catastrophe, holding reports of casualties, invasion plans, enemy resistance, and a weapon no leader had ever used before. To him, the choice was brutal, but clear. Yet history does not close as neatly as a military order. The ruins of Hiroshima and Nagasaki remained. The survivors carried burns, illness, grief, and memories of light brighter than the sun. The Manhattan Project became the beginning of a nuclear world. The United States and the Soviet Union, allies in victory, became rivals under the shadow of weapons far more powerful than those dropped in 1945. Every later crisis carried an echo of that summer, and in the center of it stood Truman, the president who had been told in Potsdam that the first atomic bomb was ready. He had answered first with relief that Hitler had not built it, then with a warning to Japan, then with an order carried across the Pacific, then with a public declaration that the force of the universe had been released from the sky. The war ended. The atomic age did not,